The silence descended suddenly, as if someone had turned off the world's sound. Mark noticed it first. He was at the wheel of his old but reliable sedan, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel rim to the final notes of some forgotten rock ballad. And then silence. Not the blessed kind that follows the cessation of noise, but a thick, cottony silence that pressed against the eardrums. The broadcast cut out, he muttered, not looking at his wife, Emily, dozing in the passenger seat. Outside, framed by darkness, occasional signs, yellowed by time, flashed by. They had been driving for 7 hours, trying to cut through rural Georgia, to avoid paying for an extra night in a motel. A stupid, penny-pinching idea. Mark tapped the dashboard. The radio was dead. Not hissing, not catching fragments of voices, just silent. He switched channels. Silence. On the navigation display attached to the windshield, the same curving road was frozen, and a warning triangle blinked in the corner. Signal lost. Damn, he swore quietly. The map's frozen. Emily stirred, opening her eyes slightly. Where are we? In the middle of nowhere. Where else? The nav's dead. The radio's silent. She straightened up, rubbing her temples. Outside there was nothing but a black wall of pines, occasionally torn by the pale light of the headlights. The road wound like a snake, narrow, without markings. The air in the car had become stuffy, smelling of old coffee and fatigue. There must be some kind of sign, Emily said, and in her voice, Mark caught a thin, razor-sharp note of anxiety. She was practical, her fear was never hysterical. It manifested exactly like this in dry questions, and a slightly more attentive gaze. They drove for another 10 minutes in that oppressive silence, broken only by the hum of the engine, which now seemed unnaturally loud. And then a structure appeared in the headlights. It was a gas station, or rather, its ghost. A low, concrete building with broken windows, veiled in dust and cobwebs. Above the roof, a rusty pole tilted crookedly, where a sign had once hung, but now only fragments of letters remained, not forming a word. Under the canopy stood 2 old pump islands, like guard robots from a past century. Everything was plunged in gloom, except for a weak yellow spot of light above the locked office door. Thank God, Emily exhaled, but there was no relief in her voice. Mark slowed down and pulled under the canopy. Gravel crunched under the tires, a sound that was sharp, almost offensive in the surrounding silence. He killed the engine. The silence descended again, now full, complete. From the forest came no chirping of crickets, no hooting of an owl. Nothing. Spooky place, Mark stated, trying to sound cheerful. As long as there's gas and someone to give directions. They got out of the car. The air was warm and humid but strangely still, without the slightest breeze. It smelled of dust, rust, and something else, a sweetish, cloying odor reminiscent of rotting flowers. Mark walked up to a pump. An out-of-order sign hung on it, as if it were its permanent state. He pulled the handle dead. Sighing, he headed for the lit door. Behind the dirty glass, an empty cash register and shelves with empty oil cans were visible. Not a soul. He knocked. The sound was muffled, as if absorbed. And then he noticed something. To the right of the door, in the shadows, stood an old beverage cooler with a flip-top glass lid. Inside, lit by a single bulb, lay several soda bottles, bright red, like drops of blood on white plastic. The labels were old, retro design, but the bottles looked new, untouched. Mark, Emily called to him. Her voice sounded strained. She was standing by the rear bumper of their car, looking at the ground. He walked over. In the dust under the canopy, where there should have been clean gravel, someone had drawn with chalk. Not children's drawings, but neat, geometric shapes, intersecting circles, lines forming angles, and strange symbols vaguely resembling runes. They formed something like a ring, outlining the space under the canopy. Their car was parked right in the center. What the hell? Mark muttered, bending down. The chalk lines were fresh, not washed away by rain. He felt a sudden cold shiver run down his back. even though the night was warm. A sound came from the forest. It was quiet, but distinct in the dead silence. A creak, a metallic, slow creak, as if an old, unsteady door was swinging on rusty hinges. Creak pause, rhythmic, like a pendulum. They both froze, listening. The sound came from somewhere behind the gas station, from the thick darkness of the forest. "We need to leave now," Emily said, and it was no longer a whisper, but a clear, icy command. Mark nodded. They quickly got into the car. He turned the key. The starter whined once, twice, but the engine didn't catch. It had been fine, they'd checked it just 2 days ago. A third time, the headlights, which he hadn't turned off, suddenly went out, plunging them into almost complete darkness, broken only by the dim yellow light above the office door. The creaking from the forest grew slightly louder. "Mark!" Emily grabbed his arm. He tried again. The starter emitted a pitiful, dying sound and fell silent. The battery was dead, though an hour ago everything had been fine. And then the light in the office went out. It didn't flicker, didn't fade, it vanished, as if switched off by the snap of an invisible finger. Now they were surrounded by pitch-black darkness, so thick Mark could barely see the outline of the steering wheel in front of him. The creaking was now right nearby, just beyond the edge of the canopy, at the spot where the chalk circle ended. He instinctively reached for the door lock, clicked it. The sound was deafeningly loud. Then a new sound came, right outside the passenger window, next to Emily's face. Tap. A quiet, cautious knock, as if someone had tapped with a knuckle. Emily held her breath. Mark slowly, agonizingly slowly, turned his head. Through the tinted glass, he couldn't make out details, only a vague silhouette, darker than the surrounding night, humanoid in shape, but wrong. It seemed to be standing, its head tilted to one side, as if curiously examining them from inside. Tap tap. This time on his window, to the right. The creature, or what they took for a creature, had moved with incomprehensible, silent speed. Mark felt cold sweat trickling down his face. His heart pounded against his ribs like a bird in a cage. He couldn't see its eyes, but he knew it was watching him, watching with a hungry, inhuman interest. And then Emily, without taking her eyes off the window, whispered words that froze the blood in his veins. "Mark, there's more than one." He glanced across the windshield. In the weak starlight barely piercing through the pines, he saw them. Vague silhouettes. 5, 6, 7. They stood motionless, surrounding the car, staying exactly on the boundary of those chalk symbols on the ground. Their outlines were blurred, as if the darkness itself had thickened and taken form. And they all were facing them. The creaking stopped. Absolute silence reigned, heavy and expectant. The creature at Mark's window slowly, very slowly, raised a hand and gently ran something long and thin across the glass. A sound like fingernails on a chalkboard pierced the silence and went straight into his brain. Their car wasn't just broken. It was in a cage, and the guards had already taken their posts. The sound of scraping on the glass faded, dissolving into the heavy silence. Mark wasn't breathing. His pupils, dilated by the darkness, tried to discern details in the silhouette at the window. But it was like trying to see the bottom of a bottomless well. The outline swam, refusing to focus. "Don't move," he whispered to Emily, though every nerve in his body screamed, demanding action. The creature behind the glass leaned a little closer. A slight, almost imperceptible cold emanated from it, seeping through the glass and metal, and the smell, that same sweetish, rotten smell of an abandoned greenhouse, now grew thicker, more tangible. Suddenly, the headlights of a distant, invisible car on some non-existent parallel road flashed through the forest for a second. The light was oblique, sliding. It lasted for a fraction of an instant. Emily stifled a moan. What they saw was not a face. It was a parody, a crude sculpture lacking eyes, nose, mouth. Just a pale, matte plane where light didn't reflect but seemed to be absorbed. And the hand, the one that had scraped the glass, was disproportionately long, with too many joints on the fingers. The light vanished. Darkness returned, even more complete, even more hostile. And then the creature at Mark's window knocked again. Tap, tap, tap. Not cautious anymore, but insistent, as if knocking on a door it knew should open. One of the silhouettes by the car's hood began to shift slowly. It didn't walk, it glided over the chalk lines on the gravel, not disturbing them. Its movement was unnaturally smooth, lacking inertia. It was moving towards the driver's side door. Are they waiting for an invitation? Emily breathed out, and in her voice, Mark heard a fragment of sober thought breaking through the panic. The chalk circle. The symbols. They don't enter inside. But they were inside the circle. Their car was in it. Were they part of the ritual? The bait? The creature at his window pressed that pale mask face against the glass. Mark recalled towards the center, towards Emily. The cold was now physically felt, like an icy plate. The battery, he whispered, his mind frantically searching for a crack in this trap. If we let it rest for a bit, sometimes it helps. They huddled in the center of the cabin, back to back, feeling the weight of many sightless gazers upon them. The creatures made no sounds. They just stood and waited. This passivity was unbearable. Mark caught himself almost longing for an attack just to end this waiting. 10 minutes passed. They felt like an eternity. The creaking from the forest didn't resume. The world had narrowed to the car's interior, ringed by quiet shadows. "I'll try," Mark said, his voice hoarse with tension. Slowly, as if under a gun sight, he reached for the ignition. The creature at his window didn't move. Mark turned the key. A click. One. A quiet, pitiful click of a relay. No hum of the starter. Not even a dying dashboard light. Complete death. But in this death, there was something new, a smell. A faint, acrid smell of ozone and something burning, coming from under the hood. And at that same moment, the radio came to life. It didn't turn on, it exploded with sound. White noise, loud, piercing, filled the cabin, wrenching startled cries from both of them. And through this noise, as through a wall of falling water, a voice broke through. Not an announcer's, not a song. It was a whisper. Many voices, male, female, childlike, overlapping, whispering the same thing, over and over, in a language Mark didn't understand, but whose intonations were filled with such primal longing and warning that the hair on his head stood on end. Emily dug her fingers into his shoulder. "Turn it off. Turn it off." Mark hit the buttons, twisted the dial. Useless. The volume only increased. The whisper turned into an insistent hum, a vibration that made the car's windows tremble. The creatures outside stirred. They began to sway in place, barely noticeably, as if obeying some invisible rhythm of this broadcast nightmare. And suddenly, in the very center of this chaos, the voices cleared. For a second, the white noise receded, and a single voice, hoarse and weary, spoke in perfect English, right into the speakers. "Don't look at their faces, don't leave the circle, they take form from your fear." And again noise. Mark met Emily's gaze. In her eyes, he saw not just terror, but understanding. A terrible, chilling understanding. Form from your fear. These things, they were empty, and they were filling up. The radio choked, hissed, and finally fell silent. The thunderous silence that followed was almost worse. The creatures stopped swaying. They froze again, but now their postures had changed. They seemed denser, more defined. One of them, the one by the hood, stretched forward something resembling an arm and slowly drew it through the air, repeating Mark's gesture when he had reached for the ignition. The movement was clumsy, simian, but studious. "They're learning," Emily whispered, and her voice was full of a soul-chilling revelation. "Learning from us. How to be us." Suddenly, the creature at her window raised both hands and slapped its palms hard against the glass. A ringing, wet sound of flesh hitting glass. A thwack. Then again. Thwack. The sound wasn't metallic, not bony. It was organic, horribly familiar. They don't want us to look outside, Mark said, feeling his mind cling to logic like a lifeline. The radio said, don't look at their faces. He stared at the ceiling of the cabin, at the fabric upholstery. Emily, close your eyes. Don't look at them. At all. But how? Just do it. They both closed their eyes, shutting out the world of visual horror. The darkness under their eyelids was different, their own, safe. For a few moments, nothing changed. Then Mark heard a new sound, a rustling on the gravel, not smooth sliding, but actual footsteps, unsteady, stumbling, as if by legs unused to them. They were approaching his door. The smell of rotting flowers became unbearable, mixed with a sweet, cloying odor of decay that hadn't been there before. And then a voice came. Mark. It was Emily's voice. Exactly. Full of frightened, trembling tenderness. It sounded right outside his window, an inch from his ear. Mark, honey, open the door. I'm scared. I'm so scared out here. Mark's heart dropped. It was her voice, every inflection, every modulation. But it didn't come from inside the cabin, where Emily sat, holding her breath, squeezing his hand so hard, her nails dug into his skin. She wasn't speaking. Don't listen. Her real whisper was hot and desperate at his ear. It's not me. Oh God, it's not me. The voice outside continued, now with a skillful, artful note of crying. Please, Mark. It's coming closer to me. I see its face. Please. Open the door and take my hand. Just take my hand. Mark clenched his eyelids tighter. An image rose before his mind's eye. He opens the door, reaches his hand into the darkness, and something cold and grasping seizes him, pulling him into the night where a pale, faceless mask awaits, about to take on the features of his own despair. No, he whispered, not knowing whom he was addressing, the voice outside, the fear within, or all this madness. No. A pause ensued, long, agonizing. When the voice sounded again, there was no trace of Emily left in it. It was a cold, lifeless sound, like stones grinding underground. You'll come out anyway, it whispered. Dawn is far. And the circle, it is not eternal. A sound came, quiet, but horrifying in its simplicity. The whisper of chalk on gravel. Someone outside was erasing one of the lines. The realization hit like an electric shock. They were not protected. Their fortress was made of sand. These things could erase the circle. They simply preferred to wait. To play. Mark opened his eyes. Staring at the ceiling was no longer an option. He looked at Emily. Her face was wet with tears, but her lips were pressed into a thin, white line. In her eyes, he saw not a plea for rescue, but the same resolution that was growing in him. To fight. Listen, he said quietly, quickly, while the methodical rustling continued outside. The trunk. The emergency hatch. It leads into the cabin. He didn't finish. The plan was insane. Crawl out through a narrow hatch into the trunk while these creatures erased the chalk line at the doors. And then what? Run into the forest, where the same darkness ruled. But the alternative was clear. They would wither here like flies in a web until their fear made them so enticing that these empty vessels decided to enter and take whatever was left. The rustling stopped. An ominous silence fell. Mark risked a glance at the side mirror. The line by his door was smeared. On the gravel lay a piece of light-colored clay or dried dirt, not chalk. The creature that had mimicked Emily's voice now stood right at the edge of the gap, 1 foot almost inside the circle. Its form had become even clearer. Mark could make out something like clothing, a dark, shapeless robe, but it could have been just a shadow. It took a step forward. At that moment, Emily yanked the lever that reclined her seat. The screech of the mechanism sounded like a gunshot. She, like an eel, scrambled back onto the rear seat and then, pushing aside the fabric shelf, began disappearing into the black rectangle of the hatch leading to the trunk. Her movements were desperate, inelegant, alive. The creature at Mark's door jerked, accelerated. Its movement was still unnatural, but now there was a predator's purposefulness in it. Sensing prey escaping, "Mark, come on," Emily shouted from the trunk, her voice muffled from inside the car. Mark threw his own seat back in one motion and scrambled backward. He saw the pale mask filling the side window, flooding the entire glass space. He tumbled onto the back seat, hitting his head on the ceiling, and began pushing feet first through the hatch. It was tight inside, smelling of the spare tire and dust. From the cabin came a sound, not a knock, but a dull, heavy blow against the metal of the door. Then a scraping. Something was scratching the paint from the outside. "Open the trunk from the inside," he yelled at Emily. She fumbled in the dark, found the glowing lever, pulled. The latch clicked, but the trunk lid only lifted an inch and froze. Something was pressing down on it from above. On both of them. Mark braced his feet against the back of the rear seat and his back against the trunk lid. He tensed every muscle, clenched his teeth, and pushed with all his might. The lid gave way with a dry, rattling screech, opening about a foot. It was enough. He rolled out first, falling onto his back on the gravel. Above him, blotting out the stars, stood two silhouettes. The cold emanating from them was a physical blow. He rolled to the side, jumped to his feet, and pulled Emily by the hand, helping her out. They stood with their backs to the car, facing the forest. The circle was broken in several places. The creatures were slowly but inexorably tightening the ring. There were 7 of them, and now they were no longer just shadows. In the starlight, Mark saw how faint depressions, hints of eye sockets, cheekbones were beginning to appear on their pale masks. They were devouring their panic, their horror, and turning it into their own flesh. To run into the forest meant to run into their domain, to where that creaking had come from. The gas station, Emily rasped. There was a door. They rushed towards the low concrete building, towards that same locked door under the dead light bulb. Gravel crunched under their feet, and this sound seemed to spur the creatures on. They moved faster, their gliding over the ground becoming more like pursuit. Mark grabbed the door handle, rusty, cold. It didn't budge. He stepped back and slammed his shoulder into the wood next to the glass. Pain shot through his shoulder, but the old lock gave way with a crack, and the door swung inward into the foul-smelling darkness. They burst inside, and Mark, glancing back, saw their pursuers stop at the threshold, not at the line of the chalk circle, but at the threshold of the building itself. They lined up in front of the open door but did not cross it. Their pale faces were turned inward, motionless, yearning. Mark slammed the door shut. The darkness became absolute. They stood, breathing heavily, in air that smelled of mold, dust, and something else old. Cold ashes. Emily found a lighter in her pocket. She clicked it. A small flame illuminated the horror. They were not alone in this room. On the walls, on the floor, on the empty shelves everywhere were the same chalk symbols as outside. But here they were drawn not neatly, but feverishly, frantically, intersecting and overlapping each other like the notes of a madman. And in the corner, behind the empty cash register, sat something. It had once been a man. Tattered remains of a gas station attendant's uniform hung on it. But its face, it lacked eyes. In their place were only smooth, skin-covered hollows. Its mouth was sewn shut with coarse, blackened thread, and on its chest, on the rotting fabric of its shirt, a large, perfect sun was drawn in chalk. The man wasn't moving. He was dead. Or not. His chest rose weakly. And then they understood everything. This man, he was the guardian. He had drawn the circle outside. He had warned others. The radio, perhaps, was his attempt. And when the forces he held back grew too strong, when they began to seep through, he drew a circle here, inside, and sealed himself in it, forever, without eyes, so as not to see their faces, without a mouth, so as not to answer their voices. This was not a refuge. This was a grave, and they had just broken into it. The lighter began to burn Emily's fingers. She cried out, and the flame died. In the last flickers of light, Mark saw that the sun drawn on the dead man's chest was beginning to slowly fade, to erase, as if an invisible hand was wiping it away. From outside, beyond the thin door, came that same creak. Metallic, slow. Creak pause. Creak pause. But now it wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from right outside the door. And inside, in the pitch darkness, a quiet, dry sound was heard, a thread tearing. One, then another. And the last thing they felt, before the darkness swallowed everything completely, was the sweet, unbearable smell of rotting flowers filling the room, and the icy touch of something that slowly, carefully, reached for their faces in the dark. On the outskirts of that forest in Georgia, there is an old, forgotten road. If you accidentally turn onto it at night, and your navigation dies, and the radio falls silent, do not stop at that gas station. Even if you see a faint light in the window, especially if you see it, just drive. Drive until there is gas in the tank and until a familiar creaking doesn't sound behind you. A creaking that, you swear, is no longer coming from outside, but from somewhere inside your own car. In the silence,